Welcome to Biz Break, telling stories that reflect the human experience. My name is Jeff Hicks, and I'll be your host. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Biz Break. Today I'm going to talk about life on Yap Island. And before I was able to go to Yap, I had to wait for 2 weeks on Guam for my visa. And so I worked there as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And my companion on Guam was a man named Nonu, Fa'alele Nonu. And he was a great guy. In fact, I credit him with being the individual who helped me get my feet firmly planted in the life of a missionary. He taught me a lot. And one of the things that he said to me before I went out to Yap was, Jeff, just love the people and become one of them. They're good people, and they'll help you understand a lot about yourself. And the secret is just to love them. And so that was my goal when I headed out to Yap. Was because their society and their traditions and their culture were so much different than what I was used to. I knew that I would just have to immerse myself in their culture and become like one of them. That was my goal. So I flew out to Yap in about toward the end of April, 1983. And I went out with a guy named Mike Sorensen. He and I were together as a group when we went out to the Micronesian mission. And in fact, he got the distinction of having the nickname Gilligan, which, was kind of a fun nickname for him. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So our flight out was fairly uneventful. We stopped off in Palau on the way, let some people off, got a few people on, and then we flew off to Yap. So Continental Airlines in those days flew kind of a route throughout Micronesia. And that just happened to be the route that we took that day to get to Yap. And in those days, Yap had an old Japanese airstrip that they were landing those 737 jets on. And the airstrip was full of potholes and was short and was surrounded by jungle and little rolling hills. And before we landed, the pilot came on the intercom and said, "Okay, everybody, get in the crash position. Because this is an old airstrip, and as soon as we touch down, I'm going to hit the brakes and the reverse thrust to stop this aircraft. And you need to be in the crash position." So I looked across the aisle. There was a native Yapese guy. I figured he was from Yap, sitting there, and he got right into the crash position like he knew what he was doing. So I just followed along and did what he did. And Sorensen was sitting in front of me, and he kind of looked back, wondering what was going on. I gave him that look, like I didn't know. And so we were all huddled down there like you do in the crash position. And the pilot was absolutely correct. That plane touched down, and immediately the brakes went on, the reverse thrust, a bunch of noise. And if we wouldn't have been hunched down there, we probably would have fallen out of our seats. Of course, the seat belts, we were seat belted in. But anyway, we taxied down to the end of the runway, the jet spun around. I looked out the window and saw the wreckage from a jet that had crashed the year before. So talk about having that little moment of fear come over me. But I was glad we didn't crash. So we taxied down, and there was a little a little terminal that was more like a little hut sitting off to the side of the runway, and that's where all of our baggage was taken. We walked through there. The guy at the baggage, at the little terminal, checking the baggage, said, "Hey, you got any stuff in this suitcase that is against the law?" "No." "Do you have any betel nut?" "No." "You carrying anything into the island that you shouldn't?" "No, not that I know of." "Okay. How long are you going to be here?" "I think I'm going to be here about a year and a half." "All right. Just make sure that you get your visa updated at the right time. You'll be all right. Welcome to Yap." So I grabbed my stuff and headed out. And that was kind of all it took to get onto Yap. Just to have the right paperwork. And I looked around as I was walking off toward where the crowd of people were, and the folks that were supposed to be there to pick us up, I figured were there somewhere. I looked around, noticed instantly that there were people with various levels of Yapese clothing. And that was the first thing I noticed. I couldn't help notice it. There was a couple of guys wearing what were called, that I later learned were called thews, and which were just little wraparound pieces of cloth. Some of them had strips of pandanus woven in there. That's all they wore, no shirt. And the women, some of them, had skirts that went from their waist down to about their knees. And a lot of those women weren't wearing shirts either. But I learned later that a lot of the women wearing those skirts, the woven skirts, were just outer island ladies that lived on Yap. A lot of the Yapese women, some of them would wear grass skirts if they were in their village. If they went into Colonia, which was the kind of the business center of the island, they would usually put on a dress or pants or something and wear a shirt. So there were different various types of customs of dress. And didn't bother me a bit. I realized I'm coming to a place where the culture's different and I'll get used to it. And the people were very nice and polite and kind. They smiled a lot. Now, let me mention, there's this thing called betel nut. And it's a little green nut that grows there on the island. And you take a nut, split it in half, dump some lime on it, and put a pepper leaf around it, put it in your mouth and chew it up, and it creates this juicy spit in your mouth that's extremely red. Looks almost like bright red blood. And I never chewed betel nut, but I understand, according to the people, that it gives you kind of a little buzz when you chew it. It's habit forming, and it's part of the culture of Yap to chew betel nut. So if you're Yapese, or if you're a member of one of the outer islanders and came in to live on Yap, you probably chewed betel nut. It's part of the culture. So I want to just tell a few stories about Yap. When I got there, my companion that was assigned to me was this guy named Paul Apita. He was a Tongan guy, and we were going to work together. And then Sorensen was partnered up with a really good guy from Wyoming. His name was Lundy. And so we all jumped in our little green pickup and headed out to go home. Now, this little green pickup was a 1982 Toyota little short bed pickup, 2-wheel drive. And it had shower curtain fenders, which means that the rust had taken over and rotted the body out. And for a pickup that was only about a year and a half old, I could tell that it had seen its wear. Probably never been washed, ever. Didn't matter. At least it got us home. And so the first story, we were invited to some really nice Filipinos' house for lunch one day, and about a month or so after I got to the island. These Filipinos were known for cooking excellent food, very tasty. And so we had Filipino chicken, we had hot dogs that were that were cooked in this egg wash. Really good stuff. Kind of a green salad thing made up of different things that I didn't know what it was. It was just really tasty. And sitting right in the middle of the table, the kitchen table, was a bowl of boonie peppers. Now, I'd never been around boonie peppers before. I didn't know what they were. But I learned when I got to Yap that that's what they were, boonie peppers. I don't know what the official name of them is, but they're little green peppers that are about 2 or 2.5 inches long, grow on a bush. And according to this Filipino lady, they were close to the hottest pepper on the earth. And she told us that. She said, I wouldn't eat those if I were you, unless you can tolerate eating extremely hot food. Well, I decided instantly I wasn't even going to try it. I didn't want to. I don't like a burning mouth. But Sorensen started bragging about how he'd eaten every hot pepper known to man, and that these boonie peppers were going to be nothing. He loved peppers. And so when we sat down for lunch, we all loaded our plates and started eating and revisiting and having a nice conversation. And suddenly Sorensen decided it was time for him to jump into the pepper eating. So he grabbed a few of those peppers out of that bowl, stuck one in his mouth, and started chewing it up. All the while saying, oh, these peppers, I've eaten every pepper. These are nothing. Well, suddenly the heat hit, and he changed his tune. And he started coughing and sputtering, and the water was boiling out of his eyes, and the snot was coming out of his nose. And we were all kind of looking at him, because he pretty quickly was in trouble, and we could tell, because he couldn't breathe very well. His face was so red that it was almost purple. And he couldn't get that heat out of his mouth. It had taken over everything. And so that little Filipino lady, she was smart and knew what to do. She grabbed Sorensen by the collar and jerked him out of his seat and hauled him over to the sink. And she ran to the refrigerator, grabbed something out of there, a little jug of white liquid. And she grabbed Sorensen with one hand and the pitcher in the other hand and started dumping that stuff in his mouth. And he was coughing and sputtering, and she leaned him over the sink so he could dump everything right in the sink. And all this while this little lady was saving Sorensen's life, we were sitting back, the rest of us were sitting back there laughing, because it was extremely funny. We couldn't help it. And because Sorensen was just kind of an idiot. He was kind of an idiot. One of those guys that you just kind of give him that look every time he says and does stuff, because he's so off the wall. Anyway, it's a good thing that little Filipino lady was there, because Sorensen probably would have died otherwise. I mean, we knew CPR. We could have helped him get air back into his lungs. But that pepper was shutting him down. Anyway, we didn't have to hear any more bragging from Sorensen about being the pepper aficionado anymore after that lunch incident. And I still laugh about that when I think of that scene. It was just really funny to me. Anyway, when we got to Yap in about April of 1983, they were having a drought. And the only water on the island came out of a well that was out by the airport, the one that we landed in, the old Japanese airport. And so we would have to take 50-gallon drums and put them in the back of that Toyota pickup and haul them down to the airport and fill them about once a week. We would get 200 gallons every week, haul it back home. We made these screens to put over the large barrels to keep the water from splashing out as we're tearing down the road, going on two wheels around the corners. And like a bunch of crazy teenagers, because we were about 19 years old. Anyway, we'd get home, and we'd have to have enough empty barrels at home to siphon water out of the barrels in the pickup, because they were too heavy to lift down, obviously. So we would siphon that water into the empty barrels at home, and then that's how we would operate. And for 3 months, that first part of my time there on Yap, that's what we did. Now, when you're rationing water like that, you're saving every drop. Of course, you have to have good water for drinking, so we would boil that water and put it in our little refrigerator, and then we would use the water for bathing. And I figured out really quickly how to take a bucket shower with about 2 or 2.5 gallons of water. And you heat up 1 gallon, so it's almost boiling, dump it in a bucket, put a gallon of cold water in, and then use that, a little cup, to put over you. You lather up, including your hair, and then rinse off. And that's pretty much all you had to do. It was easy. And you could ration the water out that way, and that 200 gallons would get us through about a week. And so that little 3 months of having to ration water taught me that it's very possible for people to become resilient when you have to, and you figure out ways to survive, and you realize what your resources are, and you don't waste stuff. And the kids learn not to waste stuff. And so anyway, that was a good lesson to learn. So my first week on Yap, Peta told me that he and I were going to be in charge of the scout troop. They had a Boy Scout troop out there. And he was the scoutmaster, and I guess I was his assistant. And it was kind of fun. We had fun just helping those boys, learn about physical fitness and about games and tying knots and, scout stuff. Now, we have to keep in mind, everybody, that the Boy Scouts of America is just that. It's an American or a Western organization. And so these kids on Yap thought it was kind of cool because it was stuff that they did in the United States and other places in the West. But a lot of the merit badges and things like that you're probably familiar with, they had no interest whatsoever in some of that stuff, like compass, orienteering, anything having to do with just scout stuff that was kind of from the book. They didn't have much interest in. But things like boating, swimming, even first aid. They thought that was pretty neat stuff and useful. And about a month and a half after I got there, we took these Boy Scouts out onto O'Keefe Island. That island is a little rock about 150, maybe 200 yards off from out in the main lagoon. They're off of Yap. And a couple of hundred years ago, this guy named O'Keefe would float a ship in there with all kinds of trading goods and would trade with the Yapese. And because of the shallow part of the lagoon near the main island, he had to moor his ship out there on O'Keefe. And when I was there, the big posts in the ground where he tied his ship were still there. It was kind of neat to see that. Anyway, we spent about 3 days out there on O'Keefe Island with the Boy Scouts. And we had a lot of fun just playing and doing scout stuff. And one of the things I noticed about those kids out there on Yap when they would go camping is we set up this big Coleman tent. And none of those kids had sleeping bags or blankets or pillows or anything like that. They didn't take any of that with them. Maybe they didn't have it. I don't know. But when they went to bed at night, the boys slept in that tent, and they just slept on the ground, on the floor of the tent, like puppy dogs. Didn't curl up in a blanket or anything. They just laid down and went to sleep. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Never seen that happen before. I can't sleep without at least a blanket over me and something underneath me. But anyway, those kids, I guess, were used to that. And that's how they operated. Well, those are the stories I'll leave you with today. I'll have more on the next episode. Thanks for listening. I hope you have a nice day. You've been listening to BizBreak, product of Voice Right Media.